Hey podcast, welcome back to another episode. Now you're going to love today's, especially at this time of year going into January. We've got Ben Price Performance Nutrition. So Ben is a nutritionist, and let me just say he really knows his stuff. You'll find when you're listening to this that he's just got an absolute wealth of knowledge on everything nutrition related. But what he does really well is that he goes a little bit into the nitty-gritty, but then always brings it back to an actual actionable advice that you can put into practice. So I think you're going to really enjoy this episode. I could go into his background. He's worked for various nutrition companies. He's worked with Olympic athletes, all sorts of people. I won't list that off because honestly, within the first 5 minutes, you're just going to realize that he really knows what he's talking about. I think the one true test whether an expert is really an expert is whether they're willing to say they don't know something. And you'll notice in the podcast, there's certain questions that I ask him and he's more than happy to say, I'm not 100% sure about that. I think that's when you really know that somebody is the real deal. They're happy to tell you what they don't know. And that just reinforces that when they're telling you something, they really know. We go into all sorts of topics. We talk about pre-ride nutrition, during ride nutrition, alcohol and the effects on mountain biking, tons of stuff. So without further ado, let's get straight into the podcast. And I hope you really enjoy it. So Ben, thank you for coming on. I think it's safe to say that you've got an extensive background, so I genuinely can't wait to dive in and ask you all sorts of questions. I thought it'd be really nice to start by asking you, why are you so interested and passionate about nutrition? How did that begin? Why do you love it so much?
Yeah, great question. I guess I started with sort of the nutrition interest came about when I was at university. I'd always been kind of interested in endurance and that side of things. And I think realizing, when I sort of first got formal sort of taught lectures on it, is sort of the realization of the impact that it can have on sort of performance and that side of things was what really kind of drew my interest into it. I'd always been interested in things like polar explorers and that side of things, which is, obviously nutrition can play a huge role there. Sort of, I think endurance sport particularly, cycling, you can see it has such a big influence over how you're able to do, the challenges you can do and your performance and that side of things, that it just kind of grew from there. And then obviously working for a nutrition brand for a little while, the sort of, you get more questions and that, that kind of drives your own learning and you get to know more and more. And it just kind of, it's evolved from there effectively.
So have you always eaten well when you were younger, or were you like a typical uni student out on the lash and eating pizza all the time and then you got more into it? How did that develop?
Yeah, I think I was fairly normal at university. So you kind of, I guess it's, I guess I'm interested a lot in the kind of science behind things, which you'll probably see from some of the answers that I give later on. But I think, your own kind of, I guess my focus is around sort of performance. So I'm really interested in how we can use kind of nutrition to become better athletes and perform better. So that's the kind of key area, I guess.
So diving into that a bit more then. So why is nutrition so important? So a lot of people, you hear all the time, don't you, nutrition's important, you've got to eat right, you are what you eat. And I think sometimes the risk that when you hear something so much, it almost becomes cliched and people ignore it. So it's ironic, but the things that often stand out on social media are the things that people haven't heard, like the fast for 20 hours a day. And, that's the secret. And then the real basic general nutrition stuff often just gets kind of overlooked. So on a real basic level for people who aren't necessarily super passionate about nutrition, why is nutrition in general so important to us as mountain bikers, but then also just as people who want to perform well through life?
I guess I'll start by saying that like my sort of real interest is around the performance, the athlete kind of side of things. Okay. So a lot of my answers will probably geared more towards that.
Perfect.
But yeah, certainly in terms of where nutrition can have impact on an athlete, there's sort of four key areas really. So first and foremost, we've got health. So what you eat can ultimately impact on how healthy you are. Things like making sure you consume enough energy to meet your daily needs. Having sort of enough of the sort of vitamins and minerals and macronutrients within your diet to sort of not be deficient in anything. These are kind of aspects of nutrition that are really important when it comes to the health side of things. So we know that sort of as athletes, we're quite active. Sort of staying healthy is really important. If you're training towards an event, it's really important that you stay free of illness and infection to be able to allow you to train first and foremost.
Course,
There's, we have data from elite athletes that shows us that the less time that you lose to illness and infection, the more likely you are to succeed at your performance goals effectively. So it's really important athletes to avoid illness and infection. So there's various aspects of diet that feed into that and help support health. The next one is training adaptations. So when we're training, the whole idea of that training is to kind of cause our body a degree of stress. And from that stress, the body kind of responds by adapting and building back stronger effectively. So that, over time, by doing lots of training, your performance increases. And how your body responds to that training has nutrition plays a key role. Things like protein for muscle building. All of the what you eat around your session can have an impact on how the body responds to it and how much benefit you get from that training session. So the really kind of sexy thing is that by using nutrition effectively around your training, you can effectively get more benefit from that training without actually having to do additional training, if that makes sense. So
I'm already going to knock you off from your 4 then, because I don't want to forget to ask you about that. So we'll definitely do all 4. But when you say that, then do you mean something as simple as doing a workout when you're fueled versus doing a workout when you're not fueled? Because obviously if you go into the gym, I've done it myself where I've skipped a meal, go to the gym and you're just knackered. You get in there and within 20 minutes you're lifting lighter, you just feel crappy, don't you? Is that what you mean, or is there more?
A degree, yeah, there's kind of 2 aspects to it. So the nutrition is going to influence the amount of stress that you can actually create within that session. So if you go out on a ride and you don't fuel it very well and you get 2 hours in and you're absolutely knackered and you come home, that's going to be quite a different amount of training stress compared to maybe doing 3, 4, 5 hours where it's well fueled and you create a lot more sort of, you stress the systems differently. And as a result, you're likely to get far greater improvement in sort of fitness from doing that greater amount of training load. So that's one aspect. There are various kind of nutrition approaches we can use around things like fueling, around using some dietary supplements. So things like caffeine and creatine particularly can help us to get more out of the sessions that we're doing in terms of the amount of work that we do. And then also we can, the sort of recovery aspect can have an influence there as well. So like optimizing the timing and the total amount of protein that we have after a session can then sort of help to enhance the adaptations that we get from that session. And as I say, effectively, it's ways that we can use nutrition to get more out of our training without necessarily having to do more training itself.
Okay, that's interesting, because you fueled better, therefore you have a better workout within that hour or 5 hours or whatever it is. And then of course the recovery afterwards, you need to make sure you're eating right to recover from that effort.
Exactly, yeah. Okay. And like, if we take protein, for example, so if you optimize your intake of protein after a session, you're likely to get more benefit from that session because you are, effectively, compared to sort of not eating anything at all, you're giving, the protein, for example, provides the building blocks for repair and recovery. So if you're getting the right intake of that protein after exercise, then, you're effectively going to get more sort of recovery and more building from that session as such. As one example.
And I am going to ask you more in detail about that later on. So for those listening who want me to dive in, don't worry, I'm going to soon. Go on.
So just to go back to it, so we've got the health aspect, we've got the training adaptations aspect. We've then got the performance aspect. So I guess this kind of feeds into training adaptations a little bit in the sense of, there's a lot of things that we can do with nutrition around competition, particularly to try and help us achieve our sort of full athletic potential. Things about fueling before exercise, fueling during exercise, hydration. There's a lot of different strategies that we can use to try and, when it comes to a key event, that could be a competition. It could be, just a ride that you've been building up towards. There's a lot of different strategies that we can use there to help make it a little bit easier to achieve our sort of full athletic potential. There's a Instagram I put out yesterday, actually, which is a kind of famous quote from one of the sort of OGs of sports nutrition, a guy called Professor Ron Morn, and he said that effectively, we can use nutrition. I've got to remember it now.
All right. It's not like you're on a podcast on the spot, so.
He sort of said that basically you can, you can't sort of eat your way to elite performance. Nutrition isn't going to make an amateur athlete into a professional.
Yeah.
But you can turn a professional athlete into an amateur very quickly using, poor nutrition strategies effectively. So
does that apply also to amateurs as well?
Absolutely,
then?
Yeah. So if you're going into an event and you've got yourself to a certain level of fitness, nutrition is there to kind of complement that and allow you to kind of achieve what you're capable of, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does.
If you don't if you don't do the right things around nutrition around going to an event, then it's potentially going to mean that you've kind of, if you great level of fitness, but you're poorly fueled, for example, you're not going to be able to kind of enjoy that event or put in the performance that you potentially have the capability to do there.
So nutrition essentially helps you tap into that fitness that you built, then, doesn't it? And if you
achieve
don't
your
have
athletic potential,
so, got you.
Yeah,
okay.
Absolutely. So that's health, training adaptations, performance, and then finally body composition, which obviously again kind of relates to the other aspects as well. Obviously what we eat in terms of the total amount of energy we take in, the nutrients that we take in, can all have an impact around our body composition, around obviously nutrition is quite a potent tool for changing body composition. So that's the kind of 4 key areas where as an athlete, performance nutrition can have a role.
And by body composition, you mean how lean or muscular you are, how overweight you are, how you look, essentially, isn't it? So how much fat you've got, how much muscle you've got. Those 2 things combined, really, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. So as you say, the amount of fat tissue you have within the body, the amount of muscle you have within the body, it can even go down to things like bone health as well, where nutrition can play a role.
Yeah. So this definitely is not written down, it's just come into my head. There's a very big body positivity movement at the moment, isn't there? Like in the media in general, sweeping the world essentially, which I think is great on one part, because I do think that everybody should be happy. Certainly don't want anybody to be depressed because they don't like what they see in the mirror. But then on the flip side of it, I think it can sometimes go too far, where morbidly obese people are kind of being told it's okay to be that size. There's no health negatives, like love who you are. Do you have any kind of views around that? There's a deep one for you. 10 minutes in.
It's not an area I've looked into in a huge amount of detail, to be honest. That's fine. Is, as you say, there's kind of 2 sides to it, in the sense of there are kind of overweight people whereby there is quite a lot of sort of, I guess, almost like things like bias within health professionals. So, you can have overweight people that go and see their doctor about something, and then basically the only response they get from the doctor is, have you thought about your weight? Or, and you can actually get people, there's can be a degree of shame around sort of body composition. So you can get, people that will avoid going to see health professionals because of that response. Yeah. And then that then means that, there can be conditions that go unnoticed, and that can have like really sort of negative impacts. If you go have cancer that's undiagnosed and can't get treatment, that's pretty devastating. There's certainly that aspect. There is that kind of injustice, I guess, within sort of health and sort of healthcare, I guess. But as you say, there's I think a lot of the other side of it is, yes, we know from, again, this is not a real area of my expertise, but sort of, we know that there are, potentially sort of quite negative downsides to being overweight and sort of, negative health impacts with that. So it's kind of balancing the 2. As I say, not an area that I've got
that's
huge,
absolutely fine. That was a question that wasn't written down that popped into my head. No, that's great. I think what might work nicely then, because as you're saying things, I keep getting about 20 questions pop up into my head, and I can feel that I'm going to go in a really random direction with everything. So as you can see before, I've got a list of various different topics, which I think would be nice. And I think it might work well to keep everything that we're talking about almost structured in a way. So the first topic I wanted to ask you about is your day-to-day nutrition, which really is going to come into all 4 of those key areas, isn't it? Because what you eat day-to-day, it massively affects your health. It affects whether you're going to train well in your performance. It affects all 4, doesn't it? This one we've already touched on. So how much protein should your average mountain biker eat? Now, this is day to day, but if you like, you already touched a little bit before about protein timing, didn't you?
Yeah. So the sort of, I guess when it comes to the sort of a figure, you might have seen that there's a lot of bodies out there. I think the World Health Organization say that we should aim for 0.8 grams of protein per kilogram body weight per day. And that's really kind of based around sort of having enough protein for it not to, for us not to be deficient at a kind of population level, which obviously as an athlete, we're more interested in how much should we consume to kind of maximize recovery, make me feel good on the bike, be able to have a good weekend of riding effectively. And they're kind of slightly different approaches. Obviously, when we ride, we have slightly elevated needs for protein. First and foremost, because we actually break a bit of protein down during exercise. We use it as a fuel source. Fat and carbohydrate are the predominant fuel sources, but as much as sort of 5 to 10% of our energy on a ride can come from protein. Particularly if we don't fuel very well. As sort of carbohydrate stores in the body become quite low, we tend to rely more on protein. So we have sort of slightly elevated needs as an endurance athlete. And in terms of the recommendations, it's on a kind of sliding scale. So generally anything from sort of 1.2 grams per kg body weight up to sort of 2 grams, maybe 2.2 grams per kg body weight. If you're sort of someone that's trying to sort of lose fat mass, for example, and sort of trying to maintain muscle whilst you're in a calorie deficit, so you're not consuming enough energy, because that can kind of
that was good. But, so you'd go so 1.2 grams to 2.2 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. So for those people listening, so if we had 100 kilogram person, you're eating 120 grams to 220 grams of protein. Now, the 120 grams is probably fairly easy for most people to get with some tweaks. 220 grams, I know from experience of doing it myself, is a lot of protein, isn't it? You mentioned that there's obviously a sliding scale. There's quite a big difference there in the amount. Is that based on like training volume? So is it when somebody's training 6 times a week or twice a day, 5 days a week, are they needing to aim for that 2.2 or not?
So 2.2 is like the upper end of kind of, I don't think I've ever recommended going above that. And that's really for kind of quite a specific sort of time frame in terms of fat loss, where you're trying to kind of maintain as much muscle tissue as possible. For your general rider, probably somewhere sort of towards the lower end in the middle. Around sort of, a lot of the research at the moment is talking around about 1.6 grams of protein per kg body weight is kind of the optimal kind of amount for athletes. Generally, I think one of the biggest factors that influences protein intake is actually the total amount of energy that you're taking in. So, you can have... if Tour de France riders, for example, a lot of those guys will be taking in up to 2 grams per kg body weight, just out of the sheer volume of food that they're eating, effectively. For a lot of us, towards that lower end is kind of 1.2 to 1.6 is probably about optimal for your kind of average sort of cyclist, really. And
would that be the same for somebody who just rides twice a week? So let's say somebody rides twice a week and goes to the gym once or twice a week.
Yeah, I mean, if on a sort of training day, I'd be certainly aiming towards that sort of range. I mean, even on sort of rest days, for example. So, one of the key reasons one of the key things that protein does is it provides the amino acids within protein. So that's the kind of the different amino acids that make up the whole protein that we consume within our diet. They make up the building blocks for repair and recovery of muscle tissue, effectively. And even, when we do a training session, depending on the sort of type of training, our muscles can be kind of sensitized to that protein intake for as much as sort of 36 hours after a session. So even if you're only training a few days a week, the kind of window where that protein is going to be advantageous to recovery and adaptation is actually quite a long window. So the total amount of it as well only really... That makes sense?
It does.
Hitting your total protein is one bit, but also the timing of it can be quite important. We've probably all heard at some point that we can only, 20 to 30 grams is the maximum amount that we can kind of utilize.
In one sitting.
In one single sitting, I I think there's often a confusion between sort of what is protein, how much protein can we absorb, and how much of that actually goes into the muscle to create new muscle tissue, for example. So, I think often people get confused and say, actually, you can only consume, you can only absorb 20 grams in each meal. Actually, our capacity to absorb protein is quite high. You could have 100 grams in a meal, and all of that protein is likely to be digested and be released into our blood. But whether or not that goes into the muscle is dependent on, as I say, the sort of maximum amount of protein that we see go into the muscle in a single feeding is around about sort of 20 to 30 grams at the very most. Beyond that, generally sort of protein just goes towards breakdown. So it will be burned, effectively converted into fuel and then burned off as carbohydrate effectively.
So what's the practical advice for people to do within that then? So should they try to separate it into 5 meals of, 5 chicken breasts, to give a really basic, simple, easy to understand, to visualize example? Is that what people should do? Or is it okay for people to eat differently through the day and then perhaps have a much greater serving of portion for dinner when they can sit down and have a steak and eggs or whatever it is?
Yeah, a lot of us, to be honest, probably get more than adequate protein within our diet.
Okay.
Generally we see people getting enough on a total basis, but what we often see is kind of, particularly in the Western world, we see that sort of breakfast tends to be quite low in protein. You tend to get a little bit more for lunch, and then the bulk of the protein comes in the evening meal when we have kind of a big serving of it. So what that means is effectively there's something called the muscle full hypothesis, where basically
muscle 4 is a number 4.
Muscle full. Sorry.
Yeah. No, fine.
That's my accent.
Not used to in Yorkshire.
Effectively, when you have a serving of protein, there's only about 20 or 30 grams of that will go into the muscle. Yeah. The rest of it will then be kind of burnt off effectively, or used in sort of other areas of the body, rather than just muscle, which is the kind of key thing that we're interested in as athletes. Yeah. So even if you have 100 grams in a single serving, only about 30 of that will be likely going into muscle. Okay. So what happens is we get sort of, we have that protein intake, we get a peak in what we call muscle protein synthesis, which is the kind of building of new muscle tissue, which is one of the key things that we're trying to look to do as athletes. So we get an increase in that, and then it sort of, it peaks and then drops off. Yeah. And then what we're effectively trying to do is get another feeding of protein in to kind of maximize that response again. And that's where the sort of reason why we want to look to get sort of, anything between sort of 4 to 5 servings per day, evenly spaced throughout the day, so that you're kind of maximizing that sort of window that you get after exercise, where that protein that you're taking in is being utilized towards building new muscle tissue and repair and recovery effectively. So what that means is that effectively what we're trying to do is get, not necessarily eat more protein, but try and distribute it better throughout the day. So having a bit more at breakfast, probably a little bit more at lunch, and a bit more, potentially a bit less at dinner, and then maybe some sort of protein snack throughout the day to kind of get those 4 servings. And by doing that, we get this kind of 4 peaks over the course of the day, as opposed to if we were to consume it all at our evening meal, you'd get 1 peak. Theoretically, 30 grams of that will go into the muscle, and then you wouldn't get a huge amount of benefit to that additional protein. But by distributing over the course of the day, you're maximizing sort of muscle protein synthesis, and therefore recovery, adaptation, and which from an athletic perspective, if you're serious about your riding and you're wanting to sort of maximize muscle mass or recovery, then that's really what we want to be doing.
Perfect. No, that's great. That makes perfect sense. Then that's easy for people to get their head around as well. 1.2 grams to 1.5 grams per kilogram of body weight, and try to spread it out through the day. Because you're right, a lot of people will have Weetabix for breakfast, a sandwich for lunch, and then a chicken dinner for dinner. So just trying to evenly spread that out a bit more. You don't really see it as much now, but there was definitely a phase. I became a trainer, how old am I now? 31. 13 years ago, something like that. Now, at the time, there was a lot of hype around protein can be bad for you. You can eat too much protein. It's not healthy to eat too much protein. You don't see as much of that sort of just generally in the world now. Yeah. Can you eat too much protein or not?
I think one of the negatives of eating too much protein is that you know if you're hitting those high kind of targets, is that it can kind of displace other nutrients within your diet.
Yeah.
So you know, for cyclists, for example, if you see someone on a really high protein intake, often the negative of that is it's displacing, you know, carbohydrate or fat within their diet, particularly carbohydrate, which is going to have, you know, positive impacts on performance. So, you know, it can be, you know, protein can be quite a satiating nutrient, can be quite filling.
Yeah.
There's something called the thermic effect of feeding, which is, you know, effectively translates to the meat sweats. You know, if you're eating a lot of protein, the energy that it's required to digest, break down and process that protein is quite a bit higher than carbohydrate and fat, which means that sort of, you can get that sort of, well, those kind of protein sweats that you get after eating, and that can kind of drive energy expenditure as well. But yeah, in terms of, I don't think there's really, you know, if you've got people that haven't got, I think there's certain liver conditions whereby, you know, those individuals can't deal with high amounts of protein, and that's definitely a time where, you know, it's a medical condition where it needs to be avoided. But for general healthy people, there's not necessarily any downsides to having sort of higher protein intakes. It's, as I say, it's the displacement. I guess potentially as well, it's where you're getting that protein from, what sources of course, you know, and that's something I wanted to get onto there was around, you know, those figures are sort of rough guidelines, really. You know, 1.2 to 1.6 for your average kind of rider is probably a good place to go. You know, maybe a little bit higher if your energy expenditure is higher and you're burning more, or you're in a sort of fat loss phase and you're trying to lose a bit of fat tissue and hold on to as much muscle as you can. But yeah, that's, you know, it's difficult to kind of, I think one of the issues with a lot of these kind of figures is that, you know, different protein sources have different sort of compositions of amino acids. Example, so if you know, we know that sort of animal-based protein tends to have sort of better compositions of the essential amino acids. There's an amino acid called leucine particularly, which is called the kind of trigger for muscle protein synthesis. So you know, the amount of leucine that's within, we're getting really in the weeds here, but the amount of leucine that's within a protein has an impact on that muscle protein response. So if you're having sources of protein that don't have as much of that leucine in, which is typical of kind of plant-based proteins, then you can, you know, find that, you know, 20 grams of animal protein isn't going to quite give you the same response as kind of, you know, as a, you know, a plant-based sort of source. So we're sort of seeing, you know, a lot of the research to date has all been done in sort of things like whey protein, for example, because it's an isolated nutrient. It's just kind of protein effectively. And that makes it very easy to kind of control things and see, you know, is it specifically
not other variables affecting it.
Exactly. Yeah. There's a lot of stuff around sort of, you know, if we have protein in a salmon fillet, for example, there's a lot of other stuff going on in that food that are potentially going to influence on the process. So a lot of the research to date has been done in whey, just because it's, you know, it's an easy thing. It's an isolated nutrient, helps us determine, you know, is it just the protein that's having the impact? I think as time goes on, we'll see more and more sort of whole food based kind of stuff. But yeah.
So on that note, she started to touch on it slightly then. I'll ask a long question so you can have your drink. So taking out the kind of moral aspect of it, so somebody doesn't care whether they eat meat or they eat veg, they're not bothered about that side of it. What's better for an athlete or for the people listening to this, the people who are serious about improving the cycling? Should they go for animal-based protein? Is it better than veggie sources of protein?
Probably a mix is going to be the best option. You know, the more variety within our diets, generally the kind of more likely we are to be hitting our sort of targets for things like micronutrients. The more variety we're getting in, the more sort of you know, beneficial compounds we're getting from different fruits and vegetables and stuff. So it's, I wouldn't say sort of one or the other. I'd say it's a combination of different ones. I think often if we're relying on sort of plant-based, you have to consume quite a lot of energy to kind of hit those kind of higher targets. So probably a bit of a mix, really. I think generally we don't consume, you know, we don't just have a meal with one type of food in. We have a kind of mix of different things. So just generally a mix of different sort of protein sources within each meal is a good way to go.
And for people who choose to be vegetarian or vegan for moral reasons or religious reasons, whatever that may be, they can be at risk, can't they, of missing out on enough leucine and things like that. So what are some basic things they can do to ensure that they get enough protein in? Because like you say, it's harder to get enough, isn't it, from beans and lentils and that kind of thing, just because for the sheer volume of lentils that you have to eat to get the same amount of protein, it's much harder to hit, isn't it?
Yeah, it depends on sort of the types of sort of protein sources that you're using, but yeah, just getting a good mix in there of different options, maybe going slightly higher. So, for example, if you were having someone who's on a, animal-based diet, they could potentially get away with slightly less total protein.
Yeah.
If you had someone on animal, a purely plant-based diet, maybe slightly higher, just to kind of compensate for those differences in amino acids, for example.
Okay.
Maybe as athletes, maybe looking at sort of supplementation with isolated kind of proteins, pea protein powders, that sort of thing, just to get a bit of just to try and as you say, often it can be quite hard if you're trying to hit those higher numbers
With whole foods.
With whole foods can be a bit of a challenge. So maybe adding one of those kind of 4 feedings in as a powder or similar can kind of push it up a bit.
Okay. No, perfect. That's really good feedback. That leads me quite now to the next bit. She touched on it then. I was going to ask you about keto.
Yeah.
But then I suppose we can extend that in general as well. So I suppose the first part of the question is, what are your thoughts on keto? Because I do get the people who follow keto, I think by design, are very passionate about it, because in order to follow a keto diet, you have to be really keen and really focused, because you can't be ketogenic by accident. So is there a place for that in performance, or should it be totally, cast out? What are your views around that?
Yeah, I'm generally not a fan of any sort of diet that involves restriction of whole food groups.
That was going to be my next question.
Yeah, you're sort of, I think you're cutting out a lot of foods that have kind of potential health benefits by going down that route. As you say, it's a very difficult diet to kind of follow. I spoke to a colleague who was involved with a performance, a research trial that looked at kind of ketogenic diets on performance. And it sounded, from they were kind of weighing out foods to give exact quantity, exact amounts of energy to the participants, and it was a real challenge to kind of get enough energy into these athletes to keep them ketogenic, because it's a very strict kind of threshold for the amount of carbohydrate you need to have to be able to do it. I guess I know the most about the performance side of things. So in terms of, I guess, coming at it from more sort of high level performance, we don't see any sort of high level athletes that are really using it, particularly if you're, the Australian Institute of Sport. So, a researcher called Professor Louise Burke, who's kind of quite a big name in this kind of area. She has done a lot of work with. They took race walkers. Of all the Olympic discipline sports, race walking is probably the one that would potentially be most relevant to a ketogenic diet, because it's just the duration of it is so long. The kind of whole idea behind ketogenics, low carb diets is effectively, we have, going into the weeds a little bit here, but sort of we have quite limited stores of carbohydrate within the body. Even a well-trained athlete that is got well topped up, rested, they've had a high carbohydrate diet, the maximum amount of energy that you're able to store in the form of glycogen, which is what carbohydrate is when it's stored within the body, it's probably looking around sort of 2,000 to 2,500 calories in total. Okay. So, we might have anything between, for a well-trained athlete, anything between sort of 400 to 600 grams of glycogen within the muscles, and maybe about another 100 grams within the liver. Liver looks after our blood glucose, so it keeps our kind of, it's the store that gets kind of drip fed to keep our glucose level. And what we see is that sort of, even in a well-trained athlete who has a lot of glycogen stored, is well rested, they only really have enough of that glycogen to last for maybe a couple of hours of very hard exercise. So it's kind of, it's not a, if you're doing endurance tasks that are beyond sort of a few hours, it can become a challenge, because we have to be reliant on taking in additional carbohydrate to maintain performance. So there's a lot of interest, particularly in endurance sport, around trying to improve our body's ability to utilize fat as a fuel source, because effectively even a relatively lean athlete has tens, if not hundreds of thousands of calories worth of fat stored within the body. Okay. And that's enough for days worth of exercise without having to kind of replenish those stores. Whereas obviously the issue with kind of relying on carbohydrate is we have quite limited stores of it. It takes quite a long time to replenish those stores. And yeah, with ketogenic diets, what we generally see is if you've got a sport where the intensity is lower. So if you're not having to do really high intensity efforts, sorry, I should chip in here and say effectively when we exercise at low exercise intensities, we can be quite heavily reliant on fat as a fuel source. It takes a bit more time to break down. It requires a bit more oxygen. It's not as efficient as carbohydrate. It requires more oxygen to produce the same amount of energy, which doesn't really matter too much when you're only at sort of 40 or 50%. But when you're going above, getting to those sort of high intensities, it gets to a point where fat can no longer kind of keep up with the demands of energy.
So I think for people to visualize, and you can correct me if I'm wrong here. So if you're on a typical 2-hour mountain bike ride, half of that might be riding on the flat or riding up a very gentle incline or traversing up on the moors. So when you're at, zone 2, maybe zone 3, that's when you're predominantly relying on fat as energy. And then when you start to do the hard effort, so when you do a descent, for example, your heart rate's going up, you're pounding down the hill. When you're going up a steep climb and you're really putting the effort in, if you're doing any kind of sprint or explosive work or anything high intensity, that's when you use more carb sources.
Absolutely, yeah. So any sort of work that we do where we're sort of getting out of breath, we're working a bit harder, the perceived exertion, so how hard the exercise feel is starting to go up, then there's a good chance that you're going to be more heavily reliant on carbohydrate as a fuel source. And we know that once we get beyond sort of 70-80% of our maximum, that's the point where we become very, very heavily reliant on carbohydrate as a fuel source. You effectively, without carbohydrate, you can't really do those efforts. If you've ever gone out and blown up on a ride and then try to do some really hard stuff afterwards, you'll probably know that it's a kind of challenging thing to do. And when it comes to performance, if you're out there to try and win a race, even if your race is at a steady intensity and you're heavily reliant on fat as a fuel source, often races are won or lost on sprints for the line, or breaking away on a hill, or just putting in more effort for a period of time to get away from your competitors. And that's where carbohydrate is really important, and we can't kind of rescue that no matter how well fat adapted we are effectively. Carbohydrate we can burn at a much faster rate compared to fat. So I guess the interest in things like ketogenic and high fat diets is to try and drive the burning of fat to make us kind of better endurance athletes. And that is potentially the case if there was a really interesting sort of research paper that got published out in New Zealand where the guy sort of basically compared different levels of athlete at an Ironman triathlon, and effectively he sort of showed that no matter how well fat adapted an elite athlete is for a triathlon where they're trying to aim to finish in a time that would be competitive, they simply can't burn fat at a rate high enough in order to be able to be competitive and finish in the time frame that they need to. But if you were to take someone who was kind of an age group of triathlete, someone who's just kind of looking for a decent time, but not necessarily to try and beat everyone, intensity is a bit lower, potentially there, because the work demands, the sort of speed at which they're working out, the energy they're expending doing that speed isn't sort of in excess of what what you could potentially get to with a low carb diet, then that may be a sort of an approach that maybe it might not be
for that individual. They may prefer to do that
exactly within that context. It may be that's the case. So from a performance perspective, generally, if performance is kind of your focus, then it's probably not a great approach to go to. As I say, I'm not a massive fan of those kind of approaches, just because of the sheer kind of the challenges with kind of cutting out those. We don't have, as far as I'm aware, we don't have huge amounts of data on sort of long-term implications of these kind of things. I know with there's a lot of talk around sort of ketogenic diets, because you sort of have quite you can end up with quite a low fiber intake if it's not managed properly. That can have impacts on sort of colon cancer and that sort of things. But from a performance perspective, may work for some level athletes, but certainly not at the sort of top end of
Yeah.
performance. I can't imagine there's many people at sort of Olympic level that are using that approach.
Of course. I think as well, like it's for the majority, if you're an elite athlete, you can do whatever it takes with your nutrition to perform because that is your full-time job. But I think for people who, you know, your everyday person or your amateur, even your amateur racer who still wants to give it everything, it just makes it so much harder to have like a really restrictive diet, doesn't it? And I think your advice marries up pretty much with what I advise with people on my app and whatnot, is that it's about just making it as easy as possible. Because you can eat a good, healthy, balanced diet and just keeping it simple, isn't it? Rather than trying to get really way too obsessed with the nitty gritty and the cutting out food groups. And that just makes it so much harder to stick to.
Yeah, I think with keto as well, you get not many people actually test if they're in ketosis. And I think you can get a lot of people.
So people eat a keto diet and they're actually burning carbs as fuel and then just end up under fuel, don't they?
Yeah, because of how stringent you have to be in the food choices to avoid kind of having that amount of carbohydrate. Yeah, I think less than 50 grams.
And even like veg can put you over, can't it? And things like that. It's like super low, isn't it?
Crazy.
Okay, no, perfect. That's great. Right, so a little bit later on, we're going to get on to pre-ride / workout, during ride and post-ride. But before we do that, we touched on it earlier, alcohol.
Yeah.
So it's quite nice, actually. I was saying to you before. So alcohol is a topic that I don't massively talk about. I think the biggest reason for me is because I don't really drink. And that's just a preference thing. I never have really drunk. I think when I was age 18 to 21, I used to go out partying every weekend. So you get into the binge drinking culture. But my parents never drunk when they were younger. It's not something I've ever picked up. So I always feel, I won't say hypocritical, but I always think because I don't drink and I don't really care about drinking, it's easy for me to say to people, drink less or don't drink, because I don't do it. But I know that what we were talking about earlier, you do enjoy your beer, don't you? You like alcohol. You can answer for yourself. I suppose, what are your views in general around alcohol? And I appreciate for your absolute elite athlete, just don't drink it, I imagine would be the advice, but you can correct me on that. But for your everyday person listening to this who trains several times a week and rides several times a week, but they may enjoy a drink, what are your views around that?
Yeah, so as we touched on, I think it's, I think the World Health Organization came out fairly recently and said there's kind of no safe sort of dose of alcohol. I'm not massively well read in that kind of area. I'm not aware of many sort of benefits of alcohol intake, positive aspect, positive impacts of alcohol on health, for example, or certainly there's very little on performance. I think it's one of those things where, it's I'm not here to kind of tell people how to live their lives. I enjoy pint myself. I think from the area I know a bit more about is from sort of a performance perspective. And I think it's one of those where there are downsides to having alcohol around sort of, particularly sort of post-exercise. It can have negative impacts on muscle protein synthesis. So the kind of rebuilding and growth of muscle tissue, that can be reduced by as much as sort of 25% as a result of having alcohol. Obviously, it's going to be relatively short term. You can have it can often sort of we get it in a lot in sort of team sports where people, professional players will, they'll have a good game they've built up to for a long period of time and then sort of, have a bit of a celebration afterwards. And that can be often we see that has negative impacts on sort of recovering glycogen stores, which, as I mentioned, are quite important for performance. So if you've got kind of a congested sort of, if you're riding one day and then riding the next, the time period you've got between those two sessions can be quite important for recovery. So trying to...
That's interesting. I'm sorry to interject, because alcohol's obviously very high in carbohydrate generally. But then that can still affect your glycogen store. So if you have a big night of drinking, that won't necessarily replenish your glycogen stores.
Yeah, so I think it's often that it replaces, it doesn't necessarily sort of block carbohydrate absorption into the muscles, but it often, like if you start drinking immediately after training, the impact then is that you don't necessarily have the optimal sort of recovery meal that you would normally.
Okay,
and then the sort of drink is replacing that side of things. So it's negative impact on sort of muscle protein synthesis. It's probably not great from sort of a glycogen recovery perspective. It's obviously can be quite a lot of calories. So you're ending up sort of, a few drinks can add up into quite a bit, which can then sort of push you into excess. And it's obviously going to have negative impacts around things like sleep as well. So, all of these things which are kind of critical for recovery, it's having a negative sort of impact on. So from, for your everyday kind of rider, it's probably best to avoid it around those times where sort of training is important, or, say you've gone away, you've gone to a trail center for a weekend and you're trying to do two, you want to make the most of the time that you've got away and get as much riding in as you can. The time period between those 2 days is probably not a great time to be drinking.
Yeah, that's good advice.
But if you're maybe riding on a Tuesday and then you're not touching the bike again for a few days, that can potentially be a time when you're able to fit it in where it's not going to have a huge impact on what you're doing in subsequent sessions, sort of thing. So, I think it's, I think
that's good practical advice. There's obviously a lot of downsides to drinking it. For people who do want to drink, just trying to time it throughout the week is really good advice. So if you're going racing, I know a lot of people who go to Hard Rock and do whatever you want, like it doesn't matter to me. But I know there's a big culture around practice on Friday from memory, race on the Saturday. A lot of people practice on Friday, get bladdered on Friday night, and then race Saturday. I'm not talking about the people who are placing top 5%. I suppose part of it for them is that's the fun of doing that, which who am I to say don't do that? But then for performance, it's probably not the best thing to be doing. There's a big culture in mountain biking of having a beer after a ride. Like, it's huge, isn't it? It's not so much from what I understand in the road cycling world, although I'm not a roadie, I don't understand. It's very much more around, because generally roadies on that note will often be very much into the nutrition, won't they? Like the really like keen on it.
Performance focused, I think.
Yeah, mountain bikers, it's a lot more hip, a lot more cool, if you like, and there's not as much focus on it. But there is a big culture of having a pint or two after a ride. Is that bad? Should people not be doing that? Get you ostracized from the mountain bike community now.
Yeah, as I say, I think it depends on what your, what level at, what your goals are, that kind of aspects really. As I say, the negative impacts it has on sort of, on recovery in terms of muscle protein synthesis, in terms of glycogen recovery, in terms of the knock-on impact on sleep. It's probably not, if performance is your focus, then it's probably not a great thing to be doing. I mean, you look at a lot of professional athletes. You see Tour de France riders where they're in the middle of a Grand Tour, probably one of the most arduous physical kind of events in the world, and often they'll still, if they've had a stage win on that day, they'll potentially have a glass of wine or a glass of champagne. So it's not it's not going to completely destroy your performance the next day. There is some interest around sort of I guess the recommendation is, if you are going to have a beer after exercise, probably the best thing to do is actually get some food in first before you start drinking.
Oh, okay.
Because that way you're kind of getting on top of that glycogen recovery before you're sort of having excess alcohol potentially. So eat before you drink. And then sort of, if you are going to go for a beer, go for something that's not sort of super high alcohol. I think there's been some interest around sort of using low alcohol beer for rehydration.
Right.
Sometimes things like sodium within the drink, within the beer, can help with sort of fluid retention. And it's, there's probably not a huge amount of difference in terms of fluid retention between sort of plain water and a sort of low alcohol beverage after exercise. So yes, you kind of, the three key aspects of recovery from a nutrition perspective is refuel. So get some carbohydrate back in your system, rehydrate, which is consume adequate fluid to kind of compensate for anything you've lost during exercise, and then rebuild, which is the protein aspect. So if you've kind of dealt with the sort of rebuild and replenish with a meal with some carbohydrate and protein in after the session, the fluid there will help with rehydration, particularly if it's a kind of weaker 2-3% kind of beer.
I think that's really, really good advice. I think it's something that people can easily take on board, that. So I suppose the worst thing you can maybe do is finish your ride at 8 p.m, have a beer, don't have anything else, and then just go to bed. If you're having a good meal in there and you're having a beer, then it helps kind of take the edge off, is the wrong word, but it supports everything, doesn't it? Oh, that's really...
I think that, I guess there's probably some effect of alcohol on sort of appetite suppression and that side of things. Or if you're taking in loads of calories from multiple drinks, then you're not necessarily going to feel like eating loads of calories in food that's going to be more supportive of performance. There's also the diuretic effect of alcohol as well. So, if you're having sort of weaker beer, the fluid within that beer is kind of offsetting that diuretic effect of the alcohol, because there's not a lot of alcohol in there, but you're getting a lot of fluid. So that can sort of help with the rehydration side of things.
Oh, that's really good. So people, but when people go to the pub, just literally going for the lower percent beer is going to be better than the high percent.
Yeah.
That's a simple switch for people to make.
Don't go straight on the spirits and the shots.
Shot of vodka straight after the ride. No, perfect. That's really good. And I think, like you touched on before, the last thing that you ever want to be doing, and I'm the same, is preaching and telling people what to do and what not to do. But I think when people have the information, they can make a decision then. And it's a sliding scale as well, isn't it? Like your absolute elite athlete he's probably going to go cold turkey around the times, of
if that's how they're making their living. It's
exactly,
you want to do the best. It's we look at downhill, for example, and probably back in the 80s it was a bit different, and 5 pints was probably the minimum before a downhill race. But things have changed a bit. The athletic progression has kind of come on, and it's dependent. For your average rider who's probably riding a few times a week, and they're not necessarily the hardest sessions in the world. It's probably not going to do vast amounts of harm. It's just looking at it from that perspective.
No, that's perfect. So pre-ride nutrition, I'll allow you to what should people eat, what should people do, what should they not do?
It's really going to be, without wanting to kind of cop out and not give a kind of clear answer, it's really going to be dependent on the demands of the kind of sessions that you're doing. Obviously, how you approach a 1 hour ride around a trail centre where, you're stopping every 5 minutes to chat to your mates is going to be quite different from, lining up on the start line of a 6 hour mountain bike marathon where you're going up big hills and you're trying to ride pretty hard. So you've got to kind of individualize these things to what you're kind of trying to do. I guess before I get into sort of how to approach it, I want to talk a little bit about why the sort of a little bit about the science behind sort of fuel use and that side of things, because that's ultimately what influences what approach you take. And as I say, when we sort of exercise,
we'll ignore that. Carry on.
There's when we exercise, there's kind of two main fuel sources that we use, so carbohydrate and fat. As I say, we've got very kind of almost unlimited reserves of fat within our body, enough for days worth of exercise, where we don't really have to be ever worried about depleting those. But carbohydrate is, as I say, something that we've got relatively limited stores of. A key kind of training adaptation that we get. So if we go from not riding at all to riding a lot and becoming a more trained, a better standard of rider, one of the key things that how our body responds is to actually increase our body's ability to store glycogen. So glycogen is the name for carbohydrate when it's stored within your muscles and your liver. For probably a low level athlete, it's maybe 300 or 400 grams in total throughout the body, which, that's probably about sort of, 400 grams of carbohydrate is, a gram of carbohydrate is 4 calories. So, 400 grams, that's 1,600 calories of energy stored within the body as carbohydrate. And we know that sort of, as I say, when we exercise, carbohydrate is the main fuel source that we use for high intensity exercise. Without adequate carbohydrate in, we sort of almost eliminate those top gears. So those ability to produce high powers, explosive efforts, ride fast up hills, ride fast down hills, pedal quickly. That's all kind of quite heavily reliant on carbohydrate as a fuel source. And also what we know is that sort of when those glycogen stores start to reduce, so if we go out on a ride and don't fuel at all, what we generally see is our sort of muscle glycogen stores will sort of generally break down as we use that energy up. And when they get to low levels, that's generally the point at which we start to see fatigue. So we start to, how hard exercise feels sort of goes up. And generally when they get to very low levels, that's generally at the point where we fatigue, we bonk, we blow up, particularly in those that are sort of a bit more trained as well. That's, if you're sort of very, very new to riding, the fatigue is going to be, the mechanisms of fatigue, so what's causing you to slow down is going to be slightly different.
Because you're unfit.
Yeah. But as you become sort of fitter, that sort of glycogen depletion becomes more sort of apparent, and that's, as I say, when we run out of carbohydrate within the body to use, that's when we kind of bonk, blow up, hit the wall. We become, we start searching for whatever food we can find. You dig out that energy bar that's been in your backpack for 3 years and is 2 years out of date. You start looking at sort of the bushes and seeing what's edible. Getting to the nearest service station for a Mars bar and a can of Coke, whatever. But yeah, that's what kind of happens when we don't have enough sort of fueling on board. So, effectively, and when we start exercise, the sort of lab research behind this sort of stuff is showing us that our exercise capacity, so basically how long we can exercise for at a set intensity. So if I was to, wheel your turbo trainer out in a second, put you on the front here and get you to ride at, say, 60% of your max, and get you to ride as long as you could until you became fatigued. If I fed you different diets containing different amounts of carbohydrate, what we generally see is like a linear relationship with the amount of carbohydrate you have in your system, so in the form of glycogen, and how long you can exercise for before you blow up and hit the wall effectively. So what we generally look to try and do before exercise, particularly if we're riding for more than sort of 2 or 3 hours and there's going to be some intensity in there, you're going to be working hard, you may be riding with people that are sort of a better standard from you, or you know that it's going to be hard work. What you generally want to do is to at least start exercise with enough glycogen on board to make sure that you've got as much kind of capacity in your system as possible. And this is where sort of carb loading sort of originates from, is that we know that the more glycogen you have in your muscles, in your liver before exercise, the longer it is before you fatigue and blow up effectively. So that's the kind of, it's a big basis of kind of modern sports nutrition guidelines, is around sort of trying to maximize the carbohydrate you have in your system before exercise so that you've got as much capacity as possible. And then for, we know that sort of carbohydrate, that if you've got sort of 500 or 600 grams of carbohydrate stored within your muscles and your liver before exercise, that's generally probably enough for sort of 2.5 hours of hard activity. Lots of breathless work. Probably a lot longer if it's a steadier ride, if you're not working as hard, if there's a lot more sort of, a lot more breaks and stuff, or you're riding more on flat terrain where you're not working as hard. There's kind of, it could be longer before you kind of get to that point. But certainly if I was to, feed you up with a decent amount of carbohydrate, get you on your bike and ride you pretty hard, after a couple of hours, we'd start to see sort of, you becoming fatigued. And if I was to drive a needle into your muscle, take a little sample of your muscle out and look at the amount of glycogen that was left in there, then we would know sort of, there's a very high likelihood that there would be not a lot left in that muscle. So what that means is that effectively for, because we have that sort of limited reserve of glycogen in muscles and liver, sort of once we get to, we certainly for activity that's beyond a couple of hours in duration, we want to make sure that we start exercise with enough glycogen in the system. And then also if we start going beyond sort of, an hour and a half, 2 hours, where those stores are likely to be starting to get low, that's where actually fueling on the bike starts to become beneficial for performance by having additional carbohydrate, which kind of maintains our body's ability to use carbs as a fuel source. Then it means that we can maintain performance, and it becomes longer before we become fatigued effectively. And for a lot of people, that's either in the sense of performance, we're able to produce more watts, or it just means that the ride is less miserable.
Yeah, of course.
You're not getting to the
There's
end.
nothing worse than being hungry and just trying to keep powering away when you're absolutely. So I suppose one big thing that I've taken from that then is how much more important pre-ride nutrition is to during the ride. You can most of my rides, the upper limit of a day-to-day ride would be 3 hours generally. So really for the bulk of my performance from a nutrition point of view, it's all about what I eat before the ride, isn't it?
Absolutely.
What's the window, would you say? So is it all about what you eat in the 2 meals before, or is that 1 day, 2 day, 3 day?
Yeah, so from it depends, which is a bit of a cop out of an
No,
answer.
I think
but
everything's like that.
There's a lot of, I mean, in terms of like how quickly you utilize that fuel is going to be dependent on a lot of different things. So like, you know, your training status, you know, how good of an athlete you are, the better the athlete, the more they're able to utilize fat as a fuel source up to high intensities, the more carbohydrate they have, the longer it's going to be. You know, things like environment, so hot temperatures, if we become really dehydrated. So if you're, you know, out in the winter and you're wearing, you know, your waterproof onesie or whatever, and you're getting really hot and sweaty, you know, that can break down carbohydrate, you know, those glycogen stores faster than if you were cooler, sort of thing. You know, things like,
so when you overheat,
yeah,
you break down carbs faster. I didn't know that.
yeah.
That's
So as you
interesting.
become dehydrated, effectively the delivery of oxygen to the muscles can become sort of less, and therefore that kind of shifts. The less oxygen you have, the more you become reliant on those kind of anaerobic processes, which are more using sort of carbohydrate as a fuel source effectively. So there's a lot of different factors that will influence the rate at which, so I can't really give sort of individual sort of, and even if you've got sort of expensive lab equipment to measure how much carbohydrate you utilize, you know, it changes over the course of a ride anyway, because you'll start off, you know, if your glycogen stores are full to start with the ride, you'll burn a lot more carbohydrate to start with. As those start to drop off, you become more reliant on fat as a fuel source. So it's,
So what about for the pre-ride nutrition? So how is that kind of, does that start 2 days before the ride? I mean, obviously it does, but I suppose what I'm getting at is if you know that you're going out on a big ride on Saturday, let's say, and for argument's sake, you're not exercising for the rest of the week, just to keep things simple, when should people really start looking at the nutrition and perhaps starting to carb load a little bit? So eating a bit more pasta, a bit more potatoes.
Yeah, so the rate at which carbohydrate goes into our muscles is kind of limited. It's not a case that, you know, it's not like going to the petrol station with your car
on Saturday morning.
And sort of topping up your tank and being ready to go. The rate at which kind of carbohydrate is stored is dependent on a few different things. It's fastest when those stores are empty. So immediately after exercise, those first couple of hours is the time where we get really fast glycogen storage within the muscles. If you're sort of if you're sort of already sort of half topped up, it's a much slower rate. So generally the sort of the time it takes to kind of go from sort of modest levels to kind of full levels of glycogen is around about 24 to 36 hours. But that's really, you know, the main driver of glycogen storage is the intake of carbohydrate. So it's going to depend on, you know, if you've got 36 hours but you don't eat any carbohydrate, it's, you know, your glycogen stores aren't going to change a huge amount.
Of course.
And if you get in sort of, that sort of 24-hour window is really dependent on quite high amounts of carbohydrate to get it into the system effectively. And that's kind of drip fed over that 24-hour period. So if you're, you know, really, we've got to assess what we're doing in terms of the activity itself. So if you're, as I say, if you're going out for a sort of 40-minute ride with some mates on a flat terrain, you know, most of the time is kind of chatting away. You obviously do not need to be cramming in carbohydrate for that. So, but if you're,
if you're doing a 6-hour enduro event over the weekend, Saturday and Sunday,
absolutely, that's the time when it's going to be of benefit. If you're, you know, effectively the way to assess it is if you're going to be out for more than a few hours. And those few hours are going to be of a decent intensity, then it's very likely that getting a bit more fuel in before is going to be advantageous to your enjoyment and your performance on the ride. So generally we look at sort of 24 hours before, maybe even 36. So starting at sort of, you know, maybe even Thursday evening meal, you know, certainly Friday morning if you're riding on Saturday morning as a time frame to kind of get it in. And in terms of the sort of the textbook guidelines,
I think I misunderstood that then. So the 24-hour, it's almost like a 24-hour deadline. Am I getting that right? 24 hours before. So if you start the ride at 10 a.m. on Saturday, you need to have a lot of your fueling in your system by 10 a.m. Friday.
No, so basically you would start fueling at sort of, you know, if you were to leave it to the last minute effectively, you'd probably start at 10 a.m. on the Friday morning.
Right, so and then it's 24 hours to the event and you drip feed up to it, and then by the time of the event you go, sorry, I did understand correctly, got it.
Yeah, so you're using that sort of 24-hour window to kind of maximise storage effectively. So the kind of textbook recommendation on this, and this is geared more at sort of quite well-trained athletes, so probably more your sort of, certainly in mountain biking, you're kind of mid to upper level racers, really. It depends on your individual sort of fitness. As I say, one of the key adaptations we get to sort of doing more training is a well-trained athlete will be able to store more glycogen than an untrained athlete.
Is that just because they have bigger muscles and they've got more muscle to store, or is it because the body is more effective at storing the glycogen?
It's a combination of more muscle potentially. The sort of enzymes that are responsible for sort of storing carbohydrate are upregulated, so they become better at doing their job.
Right, wow.
I don't know. Don't hold me to that the exact mechanisms, but it's what we generally see is that sort of the higher the standard of the athlete, the more glycogen they can store. So that then means that sort of we have to kind of individualize things a little bit so that you don't necessarily, if you're a novice rider, you've bought your bike last weekend and you go into a trail centre for a 2-hour ride this weekend, you probably don't need to be hitting really high intakes. But if you are sort of, an enduro rider who's, racing at a reasonable level and you're trying to do a good weekend, then sort of something upwards of, up to sort of 10 grams of carbohydrate per kilogram body weight per day in that loading phase is what's required.
Okay.
So we're looking at sort of
10 grams per kilogram of body weight.
So for a 70 kilo rider, you're looking at 700 grams of
so
carbohydrate.
it's way above what you can actually store then, isn't it?
Yeah. The idea being is that when you are taking in that carbohydrate over the course of the day,
you're going to use some.
Yeah.
And
so
then store some.
You basically kind of
create... That's a lot, that, isn't it?
Yeah.
Wow.
You're creating a situation where you are sort of in a calorie excess for, because effectively what you're trying to do is drive that carbohydrate storage. And if you only eat what you need for that day, then you're effectively going to end up in the same place come Saturday morning. You've not stored any additional carbohydrate. So you need that excess to drive that storage effectively.
Okay. So does that mean that, so for people who are doing some kind of big event on a Saturday or whatever, that they should carb load just to be safe?
So it depends. As I say, it really depends on the demands of the event that you're doing, and this is what.
Let's assume that it is a really tough event. So it's the people who do 3 enduros a year, and they've got that enduro. So for them, it's a big event. So assuming that it is a really tough event, not necessarily talking about just your Saturday ride, but it is a big event, they are better to carb load as opposed to just eating normally.
Yeah, absolutely. There's going to be benefits to having more glycogen available. Particularly, the thing with enduro is that you're not just looking at practice day. You're actually not really looking to perform until the Sunday. Certainly, when I kind of was racing enduro, I wish I knew a lot of this stuff that I know now, because I probably could have been a better rider. But I remember looking back at. I mean, obviously being from an XC background, I sort of. We didn't sort of hang about when it came to sort of practice. You'd often try and get a couple of runs of tracks in. I don't, obviously the different sort of events these days, different formats are there, and sort of different amounts of practice are available. But if you're, if you really want to go and perform well at an event, you generally want to get as many sort of practice runs as you possibly can in, and do as many sort of runs as you can. So effectively, you could end up doing almost a bigger day on the bike on the Saturday before the Sunday. So if you're you need to factor that in terms of fueling. So definitely starting on the Friday, even the Thursday evening, getting in that sort of high amount of carbohydrate. Generally, it's a time where sort of we're looking to consume more sort of, I guess, more refined carbohydrates.
That was literally my next question. Yeah. So 700 grams. Sorry, that wasn't 700 grams. That was if you were 70 kilos. 10 grams per kilogram. And then what should that look like then? So
as I say, this is geared more towards the highly trained athletes. If you're a lower standard, maybe 5 or 6 grams per kg, even 6 or 7 grams per kg. It's kind of a little bit of experimentation really around sort of what you're doing to see what kind of works for you, and ultimately it's going to be dependent on your sort of ability to expect, your level of fitness. Obviously, someone that can do, someone that goes around an enduro course in 3 hours and is doing average of 250, 300 watts for that time period is obviously going to expend a lot more energy, have a much greater carbohydrate requirement than someone that's doing it at 150 watts, if that makes sense. So,
it does,
but from the perspective of a kind of well-trained athlete, definitely sort of using more refined carbohydrates. If you're trying to get sort of 10 grams per kg body weight from kind of oats and bulgur wheat and that side of things, you're going to be struggling in terms of the sheer volume of food. So, but actually kind of getting at breakfast, it's maybe swapping oats out for maybe like a more breakfast cereal, Rice Krispies, that sort of thing, adding in some from fruit juice and some toast with that, so getting a decent serving at breakfast, maybe adding in, a snack of something like rice pudding, or a bagel with banana during the day, and then sort of looking at lunch and evening meal, and again, sort of maybe a snack in between there that's sort of, looking at the plate and thinking, right, okay, big serving of rice or pasta or, whatever your preference is, to kind of get that sort of intake of carbohydrate that you need to be able to do that. And yes, it's not, it's not an approach that you're adopting every single day. It's kind of a one-off approach. There's, as kind of nutrition strategies go, there's not really a huge amount of downsides to carb loading.
Okay, so it can go badly for you if you overeat on carbs on Friday.
If you overeat on carbs, the reality is it's probably getting stored as glycogen.
Right.
If you're a reasonable trained level athlete, so there's not really any sort of downsides to it. Yeah, okay. If you might go into a little bit, you're going to be in a calorie excess for a day, but it's a single day, and it's the context is that's ahead of a weekend where you're probably going to be doing 4, 6, 7, 8 hours on the bike with huge energy expenditure. So a mistake I see a lot of athletes making is kind of doing the ride and then thinking about the nutrition afterwards.
Yeah.
Actually, the fueling before is what's really going to have the beneficial impact on how you feel on the day, sort of thing.
Yeah,
so that's in terms of before. The day before, we're generally looking to kind of load up, and then if we've done that right, we don't actually necessarily have huge amounts of work to do in the morning, in terms of if you're waking up on a Saturday morning and heading straight out. So, rather than having to try and cram in a massive breakfast that's going to sit heavy on your stomach as you start riding, you can kind of get away with having a slightly lighter meal that's not as heavy to digest, so that you're kind of, light and ready to head straight out, sort of thing.
So if you fueled correctly if this hypothetical race is on the Saturday, you fueled correctly on the Friday, so you're full up and ready to go. Saturday morning, rather than going for the full English to keep you fuller for longer, it might be better going for something a bit smaller.
Yeah, exactly. So unless you're doing any sort of rigorous physical activity overnight, which, maybe before a bike race you abstain from, your muscle glycogen will not change overnight.
Okay.
Unless you're moving a lot.
Yeah.
Liver glycogen, which I say, so muscle glycogen is the main store. That's probably, well-trained athlete, probably 400 or 500 grams of carbs, sort of 1,600 to 2,000 calories. The liver, as you say, which is a much smaller store. So it's only probably somewhere between sort of 80 to 100 grams, but it plays a really important role in looking after our blood glucose, and that can reduce by as much as 25% overnight. So we're looking to kind of, the whole point of breakfast is to fine tune things a little bit, get a little bit more glycogen into muscles if you can, but really top up the liver. So breakfast wise, go for something that's kind of quite light. Something that's going to be easily digested, so that by the time you get on the bike, you're not sat with a, that black pudding isn't come back to haunt you on the on the first climb. So and in terms of when it comes to breakfast, I read quite an interesting study recently where they kind of got some people into the lab and looked at like when they had quite a high carbohydrate breakfast. So this was a breakfast with 2.5 grams of carbohydrate per kg body weight. So if my math is right, that's for a 70 kilo athlete, that's what 175 grams of carbs, which is,
a lot,
quite a lot of carbs. So it's basically like it was a bowl of cornflakes with some orange juice and toast and jam, effectively. So your kind of typical breakfast that we'd recommend before a big day of riding, because it's light, it's got lots of carbohydrate, it's fairly easy to digest and break down. They measured glycogen before and after that, 3 hours after that meal, and that meal would only increase muscle glycogen by 10%.
Whoa, wow.
So you can imagine if you're kind of relying on breakfast.
Yeah, it's nowhere near, is it?
It's nowhere near enough.
Of course.
I mean, obviously with that sort of 3 hours, I mean, that's a breakfast that should be digested and broken down quite quickly. So there was probably a reality of some of that carbohydrate was in circulation. Some of it was probably still in the having something that's quite light is kind of key there. You may, obviously depends on the sort of type of riding that you're doing as well as to what you go for breakfast. If you're going to be going out and going, smashing it from the off, you're going to be out of breath, you're going as hard as you can. Obviously you don't want something that's going to be really heavy.
Of course, yeah.
So that's where things like, your breakfast cereals, your Rice Krispies, your Cocoa Pops, your Frosties are probably, they're generally a pretty poor option for most people's breakfast, but ahead of a big ride, they're not a bad thing because they're quite light and quite easy to break down. If it's going to be a lower intensity ride, you're not going to be working as hard. You're maybe not riding until later. We can get a little bit more sort of protein in that meal. Maybe going for a bit more, yogurt or an omelette or something, just to give you that, fill you up a little bit more and give you something so that you're not hungry by the time you kind of get out on the bike. So my friend Chris has got, Chris Low Nutrition, he's got there's kind of something called the law of halves. So the textbook recommendation, and again, this is more aimed at sort of high level athletes, is that like if you've got 4 hours out, aim for sort of 4 grams per kg body weight. But basically, that, as I say, that's
over
really
4 hours.
4 hours before. So if you're eating a meal 4 hours before a ride, you've got more time there to digest that meal, so you can potentially get more fuel in during that time period. So go for a bigger meal. I mean, as I say, 4 grams per kg is the textbook recommendation, but that's really aimed at people doing sort of competition where it's very high intensity and more aimed at high intensity sort of stuff. But the principle is the same, that effectively you can have more sort of solid food, a heavier meal if you've got 4 hours to digest it than if you're eating something in the hour before, effectively.
Got you.
So as you get closer, you kind of taper down the amount of carbohydrate you have, or the size of the meal, the how light the meal is. So if you're eating sort of an hour before the ride, sort of toast and jam is probably a pretty good option because it's light and it's giving you some fuel. But if you've got 3 or 4 hours, you could potentially have, porridge and an omelette, sort of thing to get some fuel in.
Right, over a longer period of time. Yeah, of course it does.
You want to start exercise with your muscles full and your belly empty.
Yeah.
So you're giving yourself time to digest what you're taking in.
Got you. That's perfect. I could ask you 100 more questions and keep going for another hour. But for the last kind of 15 minutes, I've asked so the MTB Fit app, the app that I've got as a private Facebook group, I put a question in there last night asking for questions for you. Okay. So I thought it might be nice to put you on the spot. There's nothing crazy, don't worry. To put you on the spot and ask you some follower questions. To get some answers for them, if that's all right with you.
No worries.
So, this is a good one. This is definitely not a small topic. How do you balance fueling workouts and rides against losing weight? I've piled nearly 6 kilograms on since hitting my mid-40s, besides being really strict about a healthy diet and still working out 6 days a week. She's put on a load of weight, even though she's been strict with her diet and she's working out 5 or 6 days a week. So how do you get that balance between fueling your workouts and your rides? This is something I can relate to, actually, because I used to be a full-time personal trainer. Now I'm sedentary. I sit on my laptop all day. So over a period of a couple of years, I put on weight without really realizing it. So I think I put on about 10 kilos, something like that. And then the process of losing it for me, it was the first time I'd had to actually do a diet, if you like, and really watch my calorie intakes. If I didn't, I just stayed the same weight. And I definitely didn't have as much energy on my rides because you're in a calorie deficit. To answer, I suppose, from my side of it, I suppose it's understanding that whilst you're losing weight, you aren't going to have as much energy because the aim is to lose the weight. For me, it was a matter of, right, I'm going to get from 88 kilos. I got down to about 78 kilos. And I knew that in that process, it was going to be harder to train, harder to ride as much as I wanted to. But that's because the aim wasn't for me to fuel those efforts. It was to lose the weight. And then after that, you can switch to your maintenance and eating more. That would be my answer to it. But what's your view?
Yeah, some really good points there in terms of, you've got to kind of accept to some degree that there may be impacts on performance. Ultimately, if the kind of the weight loss goal is ahead of performance, then when you are in a deficit, it's kind of that is going to have some impact on your ability to perform. I guess first and foremost, it's kind of trying to make sure that the deficit that you're going into, so how many calories you are restricting by, is kind of relatively modest. What we generally want to do to try and maintain performance is to not go super crazy and super heavy in terms of cutting the diet in half and taking away half the food sort of thing, because the impact of that is that it's going to really negatively impact on performance. So taking a more sort of slow and steady approach, not going, maybe sort of 10 to 20% at the very most, somewhere around sort of like 500 calories a day is probably around about the point where, we will all ultimately experiment with it, see what works for you and what doesn't. But yeah, sort of going fairly modest with a deficit will limit the impact that it has on sort of performance. We know if we're training a lot and we go very heavy with calorie deficit, we can, there's a condition called relative energy deficiency in sport, which is effective energy. It comes as a result of something called low energy availability. Now, when we exercise, we expend energy that the body can't really kind of compensate for. So you imagine if you took in 2,500 calories per day, but you did on that day 2,000 calories worth of exercise, the body has no means in which, apart from making you feel tired, has no means in which to kind of control for that expenditure. So that's 2,000 calories gone. That leaves you 500 left for supporting normal physical function, and that can be long term. That can have some really negative impacts on health and performance. In female athletes, we can see athletes who are not on hormonal contraceptives losing their periods, which is obviously has really negative impacts long term on performance, health, fertility. That has impacts on bone health and these kind of things. In males, we get just a complete nosedive of sex drive. We have to be quite careful with not going too extreme with the calorie deficit. In terms of sort of going back to what you're sort of saying, sort of looking at the sessions that you're doing and trying to be quite strategic with how you fuel them. So if you are doing a session that is low intensity, you're going out and it's riding along a canal path, you're not out of breath, you're not working too hard. That's a perfect opportunity where you could probably go into that a little bit more tired, a little bit more restricted, but still maintain the training quality, get what you want to out of that session. But equally, if you are doing quality work and trying to sort of still perform at a high level, going out and sort of still trying to fuel that session well in terms of the sort of 6 to 12 hours before the session, maybe during the session itself, and sort of focusing on trying to use your fuel strategically around the sessions that you're doing and looking at the demands of those sessions to think about which ones you are going to fuel more. Also, it doesn't, when it comes to weight loss, you don't have to necessarily be in a deficit every single day until you reach the goal that you want to. We can have, if it's a heavy training day, it could be a case of, right, okay, I'm going to be in a deficit on 5 days a week, but on 2 days a week where I really want to go out and enjoy myself a bit more on the bike, that's the times where you actually, right, okay, I'm going to go back to maintenance calories and rescue a bit of performance there and sort of hopefully have less of an impact on training. It's with sort of weight loss, it is the average of the weeks and the months that counts. It's not your daily, it doesn't matter if you've had sort of 6 days of deficit, if 1 day a week is
6,000 calories.
Is wiping that out. And equally, it doesn't necessarily have to be, it doesn't have to be every day in a deficit to still be able to make progress and influence performance. So the one last thing I will say there is in terms of sort of during the session itself, caffeine can be quite an effective way of recovering some performance there. So if you've got someone that's really kind of, if you're going into that session fatigued because you haven't got the sort of best nutrition, you're not consuming enough energy, then having some caffeine during that session or in the 30 to 40 minutes before can help sort of. Caffeine works by blocking fatigue receptors in the brain, and that can kind of help rescue a bit of performance. A bit of carbs while you're on, sports drink or whatever, while you're doing that session can then help to sort of help maintain performance without it negatively impacting on, help maintain performance in spite of the deficit sort of thing.
Yeah. That is a great answer. Thank you. That's exactly how I did it as well when it came to my losing my weight. It was a matter of doing it gradually. So I aim to lose like £1 to £2 a week. So half a kilo a week, something like that. Some weeks I did, some weeks I didn't, but I tried to keep my calories as high as I could while still losing the weight. And I was the same. I tended to eat a little bit more on a weekend because you go out to restaurants and things like that. So I'd eat slightly less than I would have done for the average through the week and a little bit more on a weekend.
Yeah.
That was great.
Just one other thing to mention there as well is that, when it comes to sort of, generally as athletes, we talk about weight loss. We're not really interested in weight loss at all. We're interested in fat loss. We don't want to necessarily be, it's a pointless procedure to go through kind of weight loss and lose a few kilo of muscle. So what we're really trying to do is drive fat loss, and where that kind of tissue comes from is dependent on a lot of different things. But one of the key things that we can do around sort of to try and drive fat loss rather than weight loss is to try and maintain training. So that stimulus of resistance training, even on the bike, if you're doing short, sharp efforts that require a lot of power, that's very similar to kind of high rep, low weights in the gym. By having that stimulus of kind of some resistance exercise and combining that with a higher intake of protein. So going back to what I said early on, sort of, upwards of sort of the 2 grams per kg, that can sort of help to maintain as much muscle mass as possible. Protein has the benefit of, as I say, being, a lot of foods with protein in a sort of quite filling. So that can help with the sort of maintaining the deficit, the thermic effect of feeding, so the energy it's required for breaking down and digesting protein, and also it helps to kind of maintain as much sort of muscle mass as possible, so performance is maintained. When we go into a deficit, muscle protein synthesis, so that growth of new muscle tissue can be reduced by as much as sort of 25%. So adequate protein with training can help to sort of sort that.
Yeah, no, perfect, that's great. This next one's a specific one for you.
Okay.
I'm training for my first marathon alongside mountain biking. I've never used gels before. I'm also a sustainability manager in the NHS and don't want to use single-use gel packets. Is there an alternative I can make myself and carry in a reusable container? And then the last bit, she's saying, thanks for my app. So as much as that'd be great to hype me up, I won't read that bit. So what she's asking is she doesn't want to use gels because they're single-use plastics. What's an alternative?
Yeah, so effectively, I'm sure there's plenty of kind of gel recipes out there. Effectively, all a gel is a kind of powdered form of carbohydrate, either like glucose or maltodextrin. Maltodextrin is just glucose, but loads of molecules of glucose stuck together. They both kind of deliver carbohydrate in the same way. You can buy them powdered from a lot of pharmacies or a lot of your kind of online supplement stores. All of gel really is kind of that powder with some water, often a preservative, if it's in a packet for a couple of years. So you can make them. You can make a gel. Effectively, all a gel is a concentrated version of a sports drink.
Of course, yeah.
So just having a scoop of some sort of carbohydrate based powder, maybe with a bit of some sort of flavor, whether that's squash or whatever, and a small amount of water to make it into a kind of concentrated drink, and you've got what a gel is effectively.
Perfect. We've answered that. Okay. I usually put electrolyte powder in my water during the summer, but I also use Cliff Blocks as an energy chew. But Cliff Blocks also have electrolytes. Is it possible / bad to put in too much electrolytes?
I'm really glad you asked me this one, because it's kind of the sort of research. We don't really have a huge amount of research around the sort of requirements for electrolytes, and it's something that I've kind of, there's been a group over in Australia at Monash University that have published some work on this. A guy basically realised that we didn't have a lot of evidence on it, dedicated his PhD and his work after that towards sort of looking at electrolytes for endurance athletes. And it kind of, there was a paper published fairly recently by them where they kind of modelled the requirement for electrolytes. Sodium is the kind of really the only electrolyte that we lose in, sodium, which is salt effectively, is really the only electrolyte that we lose in any sort of quantity during exercise. So it's the main one that we kind of look to replace. But effectively with electrolytes, when we sweat, our sweat is hypertonic to plasma. So plasma is the water component within our blood. Hypertonic means it has less. So effectively, when we sweat, the concentration of the sweat has less sodium in and more water than the plasma within our blood.
Okay.
The reason for that is because the sweat ducts in our skin reabsorb the sodium to kind of maintain sodium levels within the body. So what that means is effectively, as we exercise, we are actually increasing the concentration of sodium within our blood plasma. affect, so we're not really actually sort of, so in terms of replacing electrolytes, it's not until, or sodium at least, it's not until we're actually consuming quite a large proportion of fluid and replacing the losses that we've had during that exercise activity that we have any sort of requirement for sort of actually consuming electrolytes during exercise. Now, there are a few sort of small benefits to taking on sodium during exercise. So having something salty stimulates thirst, which can then increase fluid intake, which can then, if you're an athlete and you've ever sort of tried to replace fluid during exercise, having that bit of salt in there can help to drive a bit of thirst and sort of help you drink more, which then means you're going to replace more of the fluid, and that's going to help offset dehydration. Yeah. There is a small impact of sodium in terms of fluid absorption and retention. So having sort of salty stuff, more of it stays within the system, so you excrete less of it out as water. But effectively, going back to what I was saying, this model that this guy's come out with based on sort of, the quantities of sodium that we have within our sweat, unless we're exercising for over 4 hours in duration, and unless we're looking to replace beyond 70% of what we've actually lost during exercise in terms of the fluid, which is, potentially is only really applicable when sweat rates are fairly low, because there's often times where we're exercising in the heat where the sweat rate that we're going at is well in excess of what we'd, you can't. I've had a guy in my former job where we had an environmental chamber training for the Marathon des Sables. He was at the end of his acclimation, ready for the event itself. He was sweating 2.7 litres per hour.
Wow.
So you can imagine trying to drink 2.7 litres
back, is he?
You couldn't physically stomach that volume of fluid.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
So effectively, unless you're exercising for more than 4 hours, and unless you're replacing a very large proportion of the fluid that you're losing, then there's little requirement other than sort of season to taste to actually replace electrolytes during exercise. Effectively, don't really worry too much.
You don't need to have them,
for a marathon, you might be out for sort of 3 or 4 hours. Yeah. But the reality is you're probably not. You don't necessarily want to be replacing, the volume of fluid that you're losing during that time period. Generally, we always do not want to. There's a condition called hyponatremia, which is where effectively we dilute the electrolytes within our body, which is part of the reason why we get some justification for taking in sodium during exercise. But that is largely driven by excess fluid intake. So generally what we don't want to do is drink too much beyond what we're losing, because otherwise that's going to lead to, and that generally, if you're someone that's reasonably well trained and working hard, that's kind of fairly unlikely to happen. Yeah. The cases of hyponatremia generally happen in very long events where people are out for a long period of time. Intensity is low, sweat rates might not be super high, but there's kind of a lot of fluid intake. Yeah. There's been cases where people at marathon, big city marathons have died of it. And generally it's not the guys in the sort of, it's not the people within the sort of first 50% of it. It's generally those more towards the back, running at a lower pace, but they're stopping at every drink station and drinking in excess of kind of fluid intake, really. So, effectively, just, if you're consuming some products with electrolytes in, then go for it. But otherwise, don't really worry too much about salt intake.
That's really interesting, because as an absolute rule, I'll go out in the winter, I just take a water bottle, always put an electrolyte tablet in it, even just for a couple of hour ride around here. So I'll stop.
To be honest, one of the things with the electrolyte tablets is often it's just the kind of a lot of people use them. I think just for the palatability side of things, having
it is
something
a nicer
that tastes a bit nicer is.
But then I do find that it almost feels like it dehydrates me more. Obviously, it doesn't necessarily dehydrate me more, but I get thirstier in the evening for sure. Even though if I go out on a day like today, I'm not sweating that much. When I have that electrolyte tablet, I am much more thirsty for the next 2 or 3 hours. So, no, that's good to know.
Yeah. And in terms of, just to touch on sort of the cramp side of things, a lot of people talk about electrolytes for cramp. There's not a really solid link between the two. Okay. There's a lot of other reasons why you can potentially get cramps, which, so there's not a lot of need for sodium from that perspective either.
Perfect. Oh, that's great. Here's a funny one. You don't have to answer this one. At Christmas, do pizza and beer calories count? Although this has come out in January, actually.
So, yeah, it's obviously going to count. The reality is with Christmas that, a couple of days of excess. Again, I think often athletes will kind of, they'll hyper focus in on one area of diet. So one meal or one bit of food that they eat, forgetting about the rest of the time. It's kind of, the sort of analogy that people like to use is kind of, it's like mowing the lawn while the house is on fire.
Yeah.
What I'd say is like, don't worry too much about what you do at Christmas. Worry what you do for the other 12 months of the year.
Of course, yeah.
So
yeah. No, perfect. That's really good. It'll be too late for everybody now. I think this comes out about January 8th. I think this podcast comes out.
Okay, great.
So yeah, people should be smashing it when they're listening to this. Right, last one. What's the easiest way to eat healthy meals that take little time to prep? I'll answer this one first because I won't bore you with the details, but I'm going through like a busy period of life now where Sophie's granddad's in hospital, the house has been upside down. So one thing that I've been doing, and I generally do, is buy the salad pots from Tesco or Co-op this morning. And when I say salad pots, I mean like, you can get the pasta spinach like with pine nuts in, and then I get a separate one, which would be, what have I got upstairs? Little new potatoes and a little bit of yogurt, some couscous. I tend generally buy 4 of those and then some cooked meat if I've not cooked it myself, and then that'll be a ready-made lunch. I've got one for today. Yeah. Is it as good as me making my own meal? No, because there's more additives, more salt, more that. But then compared to having a microwave pizza, obviously they're a million miles better. You're welcome to give your opinion on what I've just said as well. And then, obviously you can answer the question.
Absolutely. Trying to kind of engineer your environment so you're making, it's easy to make those kind of choices that are going to support your goals is having a freezer full of meals that you've cooked that, the kind of composition of them. If you've that a bit more money, even going to kind of, there's a whole host of kind of meal prep companies out there now. There's ways of getting kind of healthy foods that are, that are easily accessible, don't require the kind of, you don't necessarily, you don't have to cook every meal from scratch for it to be healthy.
Yeah.
It could be a case of just having a few backup options that, even if you've got, I don't know, a Tesco down the road and that when I go in there, okay, there's some fish cakes that are, they're fine. I can get some, some green veg to go with that. And that's a meal that takes 10 minutes to prepare. Having that plan B there ready to go, and having thought about it before the time where you need to make that decision, is probably key to helping, with those kind of things.
Yeah, perfect. No, that's ideal. Well, like I say, I could definitely keep asking you questions for the next hour. We'll have to get you on again. I think I asked you about half of the ones I had written down, so we'll have to get you on for round 2. Yeah. No, definitely not. It's interesting. It's such a massive topic, isn't it, at the end of the day? I can guarantee that people listening to this might want to work with you. They want to hear some more information about you. So what's the best way for people to follow you, to get in touch with you?
Yeah, so I'm fairly active on Instagram, so Ben Price Nutrition. That kind of has all the links to the relevant stuff as well. If you're looking for more help, I'm either I work with people directly, or we also have a friend of mine, Chris, who's also a sports nutritionist. We've developed something called Fuel the Ride Academy, which is a
The working with you one-to-one, that's one-to-one. The Fuel the Ride Academy, am I right in thinking that that's something that people sign up to and then go through at their own pace?
Yeah, so we've got sort of, we've basically created Chris has created a program whereby, we take you through kind of all of the key aspects of nutrition that you need to know as an athlete. We tried to kind of cut it down so it's what you need, and it's sort of delivered through an online training platform. So you kind of sign up for 6 months. There's it's really for those that want kind of the more in-depth stuff, and want to go at it at a decent level. But we've created all the resources and all the sort of stuff you need to be able to do, sort your nutrition out yourself and optimize it for you as a sort of cycle sport athlete. So on top of the kind of course and the videos, we've got a community. We host weekly webinars so you can ask questions, and so there's a degree of support in there as well alongside the videos to watch. So we've made it specific for cycle sport athletes. So definitely worth checking out.
Yeah. Oh, excellent. Well, I'll leave all the links to that under YouTube or in the podcast app wherever you're listening. But it's been a fascinating 90 minutes. So thank you so much for coming on.
No worries at all. Thanks for having me. Cheers.